Near-death experiences have gone from a taboo subject to one that is finally being taken seriously by science. There have already been several completed studies and several more are underway currently. From some of the completed studies, we have gotten some shocking information that has massively changed the idea of death and consciousness. There are now countless documented stories of people that have recalled things after being pronounced clinically dead that they should not be able to recall. These types of NDEs are known as Veridical NDEs. Today we look at 5 of the most compelling Veridical NDE cases that have been studied the most and that science does really not have answers for. These come from a study that looked at the 10 best documented NDEs, and they came to the same conclusion as the original studies did. And that is, these patients should not have been able to recall what they did. And consciousness continuing beyond death is a very likely explanation. The first NDE comes from the Dutch study by Pim van Lommel. One of the patients in the study was a man who'd been found in a meadow who had a heart attack. He was brought to a hospital and CPR was performed. He had all 3 signs of clinical death when CPR was started, including no pulse, breathing, and dilated pupils. CPR was successful, after which the man was in a coma for an entire week. After that week, he was in the cardiac ward where the nurse that performed the resuscitation came in to give him medication. The patient said that the nurse was the one who was there when the man was brought in for resuscitation. He said the nurse took his dentures out of his mouth and put them in a sliding drawer on the crash cart that is used for CPR. The story did check out, and there was no way the patient could have physically perceived any of this since they were clinically dead at the time. The next logic-defying NDE comes from Batinapton. She was 32 years old and in her 2nd pregnancy. There were some major complications found during an ultrasound that required a high-risk procedure to be performed to save both the baby and the mother. This procedure would entail a large amount of blood loss. So in advance, Bettina began donating her own blood to the blood bank to be retransfused during the procedure. Bettina was put to sleep by the anesthesiologist, only to be awakened mid-procedure to a state of heightened awareness she had never experienced before. She hears her anesthesiologist say that her blood pressure is too low. Bettina describes being completely calm and at peace while watching her lifeless body on the table. She can feel the tugging sensation at her abdomen, but she feels no pain. She hears the surgeon say that the baby is gone, and Bettina has lost a lot of blood. Then she hears a loud scream behind her say, now she has no blood pressure at all. Instantly, a profound stillness was felt at the center of Bettina's chest. She can feel that her heart has stopped. She can see everything in the room despite her eyes being taped shut. Suddenly, the cardiac monitor starts to alarm that the heart has stopped. Bettina sees the anesthesiologist hit the button that calls for the resuscitation team, and she sees the anesthesiologist start CPR. Bettina sees the light, and she described it as pure consciousness. She says it's all-knowing, infinite, and pulsating with potentiality. Then suddenly she hears a voice. You must live. This voice resonates 3 times, and she is then taken back to her body. She sees the anesthesiologist pumping her chest. She sees the resuscitation team rushing in. She describes in intimate detail things she should never be able to describe, such as a surgeon rushing in and grabbing her aorta with his bare hands to prevent further blood loss, without even putting gloves on because time is running out. She describes in detail how her anesthesiologist had trouble inserting a line in her right wrist, and eventually goes to insert it near her elbow. All of these things should be impossible for Bettina to recall with no heartbeat and no blood pressure. But she did, and she did so in excruciating detail. The next NDE is about a patient from Dr. Chris Yerington named Frank. Towards the end of a 33-hour shift, Dr. Yerington begins to work on Frank, who was brought to the OR, dead. No vital signs at all. They worked on him for about an hour. Miraculously, Frank is brought back to life. Dr. Yerington did not have high expectations that Frank would ever recover in the ICU. In another miracle, Dr. Yarrington comes back to the hospital 30 hours later. He says Frank is alive and he's eating breakfast and he seemed fine. And he was. Nurses were saying Frank remembered everything from the surgery, including a phrase Dr. Yarrington uttered where he said that if you're good enough in anesthesia, you can take a piece of steak, put a tube in it, and put it in the ICU and claim it is alive. In fact, Dr. Yarrington specifically referenced a 54-ounce porterhouse. This was because things did not look good at all for Frank in the OR, and the main goal really was just to keep him alive long enough for his family to say goodbye. Further, Frank recalled details about the serial number on the top of the surgical lights. At the time, Dr. Yarrington didn't believe it, but eventually after talking to Frank several times, he decided to check the top of the surgical light, and the serial number was correct. Dr. Lloyd Rudy is a cardiac surgeon who was working on a patient on Christmas Day who had serious issues with one of the valves on his heart. They performed an emergency repair to the valve, but they cannot get the patient off the heart and lung bypass machine. Every time they tried to remove him from the bypass machine, his heart would not take over and the team eventually had to pronounce him dead. Life support was turned off and the patient was pronounced dead. The vitals machines that monitor his heart rate and blood pressure were left on, however. After about 20 minutes, as the doctors were standing in the doorway talking about what they could have done differently, suddenly the patient's heart started beating again, and the patient ended up surviving. The patient made a miraculous full recovery with no neurological deficit, which is astonishing for a patient that went that long without a heartbeat. The patient described his NDE, the typical bright light, but also in-depth descriptions of things that happened in the OR room. Most notably, he described post-it notes that the nurses had put on one of the monitors for the cardiac surgeon. He describes details of what was on the post-it notes and when they were put on the monitor. There's no explanation for this other than life after death being a very real possibility. Pam Reynolds had a large aneurysm in her brain. Because of the difficult position of the aneurysm, Reynolds was predicted to have no chance of surviving surgery to have it removed. As a last resort, a standstill operation or medically induced hypothermic cardiac arrest was attempted. During this procedure, Reynolds' body temperature was lowered to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing and heart were stopped, and the blood was drained from her head. Her eyes were closed with tape, and small earplugs with speakers were placed in her ears. These speakers emitted audible clicks which were used to check the function of the brainstem to ensure that she had a flat EEG, indicating a non-responsive brain, before the operation was allowed to proceed. The operation was a success, and Reynolds recovered completely. The total surgery lasted about 7 hours with a few complications along the way. In essence, Pam was dead during the entire operation that was very well documented. Reynolds reported floating above the operating room and watching the doctors perform the operation. She reported seeing the surgical saw, but said it looked like an electric toothbrush, and this checked out. Pam was able to recall precise conversations between operating room staff. One of those conversations involved a female nurse talking about Pam's veins and arteries in her left leg being too small for the heart and lung machine, so they had to move to the right leg. Another thing she recalled is the song Hotel California playing during the procedure. And these were all things that happened. This NDE has been the cornerstone argument for life persisting after death due to the severity of the surgery and the vivid details Pam was able to recall. NDEs have a rating scale called the Grayson Rating Scale. And Pam's NDE scored a 27 out of a possible 32, which is way above the average score of 15. So what do you guys think? Do these NDEs prove that the afterlife is real, or do you remain skeptical? I was a skeptic for a long time myself, as I tend to need concrete, verifiable information to be convinced of something. But that is what is shocking about these Veridical NDE accounts. There is a lot of verifiable information attached to them. In fact, to me, of all the paranormal phenomenon people talk about, I think NDEs are the most compelling and have the most convincing data surrounding them. It's not just anecdotes at this point. People recalling details they should never be able to recall about operating rooms and the procedures they underwent while being clinically dead is at a minimum fascinating.